folks, it's me. I'm back. I know it's been like months since the last time I uploaded a video. The YouTube algorithm is absolutely hating me for this. But as I told some of you guys before, I've been working on a book. And as you can see, I've had some changes to my set, so there's that. Anyway, I've been working on this book about the Dumond affair and how it sort of ties into the wider sort of misinformation, conspiracy theory, media ecosystem that we're all living in right now. So what's the Dumond affair, I can hear you asking? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the Wayne Dumond case goes back to 1984. So it's a big thing and it has a whole lot of ins and outs, a whole lot of what have yous. But let me just talk about the actual case first. The case goes back to 1984 in a town called Forest City, Arkansas. And this was a young woman named Ashley Stevens. She was 17 years old, a cheerleader, and the younger daughter of Stevie Stevens. His real name was Walter Stevens III. And he was the third generation owner of the family funeral home, Stevens Funeral Home. Which, if you know anything about funeral homes, you know that these are the businesses that always make money because, obviously. So, you know, she was kind of old money. But anyway, she got out of school at about 2:30 on September 11th and walked home. The door was unlocked because this was 1984. This was a safe neighborhood. No one ever locked their doors. She said she came in, took off her shoes, and kind of just started doing homework, kind of halfway watching TV, kind of hoping one of her friends might call and they could go hang out. You know, the kind of thing you did as a teenager in the 80s. She said she'd only been home for just a few minutes when suddenly this man burst in through the side door. She said he was really scraggly, kind of tall and slender, but the thing she noticed the most about him were his, quote, crystal blue eyes, like blue eyes. The guy had a paper bag in his hand and a knife. He tied her up, threw her into her car, not his, so she could see that his vehicle was parked there. It was a red Ford pickup truck, and it had a missing headlight and a missing tailgate. So anyway, he puts her in her car, makes her lay down, and proceeds to drive off. Now, even though she was like laying down in the passenger seat, you know, she'd lived in Forest City her whole life. So she could tell just by what she could see going by in the window where she was at. So he drove her, you know, a series of roads until they got to this one particular dirt road where they got out. So once they get to this wooded area, using the knife, he cuts off her sweater and then forced her pants off of her. He tried to sexually assault her in the quote-unquote traditional way, and he found that he couldn't do that. He told her, "You're going to have to help me," and then forced her to perform oral sex on him. He finished in her mouth, and she spit it out, and some of it got onto her jeans, which were, you know, laying on the ground. He then sexually assaulted her in the quote-unquote traditional way, very briefly. Then, after he was done, she asked him, "What do you want from me?" And he said, "Your life." She begins begging and pleading, crying. She claimed her mother had cancer. And, you know, she's just basically trying to make anything up to play on his sympathy. Promises she won't tell anyone what happened, you know, all that. So apparently it worked because he puts her back in the car and drives her back home. Once he sort of gets her in the house, he gets back in his truck and drives off. She, of course, called the cops, told them everything that happened. They were able to follow her directions, and sure enough, they found the site where everything had happened. The appearance of a struggle and the tire marks and everything totally corroborated what she said happened. They dusted her car for fingerprints, but none of them were really usable. They did take biological samples from her and from the jeans that she had spit out onto as well. and set those off. Now remember, this is 1984, so they don't have specifically DNA testing, but they can do sort of other tests that, they might not be exactly pinpoint accurate like DNA, but they can at least exclude suspects, right? At the police station, she's shown a couple of different photo lineups. She doesn't identify anyone there. There was one particular man that she said, yeah, he looks like that guy, but she did not say that was the guy. She just said he looks kind of like that guy. Several weeks go by and it's late October and she's in a car with a friend driving around downtown in Forest City, and they're stopped at a stoplight getting ready to take a left-hand turn. And she said that red pickup truck drove past. She said she was able to look and see the man very clearly. Again, she recognized his crystal blue eyes. He wasn't scraggly anymore. He had clearly shaved, and he had replaced the tailgate on the back of his pickup truck. But otherwise, it still had the missing tail light. It still looked exactly the same. It was the same guy. It was the same guy. As he drives off, they were both able to write down the license plate number and went immediately to the cops. So the cops were pretty quickly able to trace down the car registration to this man named Wayne Dumond. And they arrest him and take him in. He doesn't say anything, which is his right. But as they're learning more about this guy, they find out that, he's kind of known for this. He had a woman in the 70s who identified him as someone who broke into her house and held her at knife point while her 3-year-old daughter was asleep next to her in the bed. He threatened her and said if she made a noise or told anyone, he would kill her daughter. So she said she laid there in the bed and stroked her daughter's hair to make sure her daughter didn't wake up while Wayne assaulted her. She was so afraid that she didn't go to the cops for several weeks, but her friends kind of encouraged her to do so. And so she did. When the cops arrested Wayne, he basically confessed to them, but then when they asked him to sign the statement, he refused to do so. The woman was still, again, so frightened that she said she didn't want to testify, so the charges were dropped. Sometime later, he had burst into another woman's house in Little Rock with a knife and was about to do something, but then he noticed that the woman's boyfriend was sleeping in the bed next to her, and so he just ran off. The woman went to the cops, but the cops were like, we don't really have anything to arrest him on. I mean, yeah, okay, breaking and entering, but so basically the cops told her, just don't worry about it. Another time, when Wayne was stationed in Tacoma, Washington, he was in the parking lot of a mall when he attacked an 18-year-old woman. The woman went to the cops and told them that he had held a knife to her and was trying to get her to get into his car, but she screamed and fought and was able to escape. Now, Wayne claimed that was not the case at all, that he had just been innocently walking through the mall parking lot when this woman almost ran him over, and so he had shown her his knife just as an act of, self-defense, I guess, or something. Well, they didn't believe him, and he was arrested and was sentenced to some months, not very long, and was required to undergo psychological counseling. Through that psychological counseling, we later find out that he was diagnosed as being schizoid, extremely paranoid, and especially touchy about his manhood. So anyway, back to Forest City, 1984. So he was arrested in November, right after he had been identified by Ashley. So while he was at home awaiting trial, he was at home by himself when 2 men burst into his house. He said his attackers were wearing stockings, like pantyhose over their faces, and had big rubber green gloves. He said they weren't surgical gloves because they didn't fit like that. They were more like big rubber gloves. Okay, remember that. These 2 men hogtied him, forced him to the ground, and castrated him. They slit open his scrotum, pulled out his testicles, and left them there. One of them said to the other, Mr. C would be proud. And they left. Wayne said he laid there and struggled and was able to eventually get his hands free, but he was losing a lot of blood and eventually passed out. Not much later, his sons came home from school, walked into the house, and saw this bloodbath. The youngest one told the older one told the younger one to run to a neighbor's house and call the police. The older one then, kind of helped his dad get untied, and they waited there for the cops. So the ambulance arrived and took Wayne immediately because he was, in almost mortal condition. There were first Arkansas State police officers who showed up, but right after they arrived, the sheriff of the county, St. Francis County, named Coolidge Conley showed up. Conley walked in, saw Wayne's testicles lying on the floor, covered in blood. He takes a matchbox, scoops up the testicles, and leaves. So anyway, this was county sheriff's business, so Coolidge Conley was the one who basically had jurisdiction over this particular crime. He never found anybody, and it would later be discovered he really only questioned 2 or 3 people the day afterwards and then basically closed the case.
Suspicious.
So anyway, after that, Wayne and Dusty sent the kids to go stay with other relatives. They went back to his family home in DeWitt because they didn't feel safe in their house, which is understandable. While they were gone, their house burned down. Now, the fire department said, it started in the attic. It looked like it was probably just an electrical fire, but
that's weird.
And the other interesting thing to happen after Wayne left town was that it was discovered, it kind of came out through various people talking, that Sheriff Conley had kept Wayne Dumond's testicles in a jar in his office and was showing them off to anyone he could rope in. He would say, "This is what happens when you rape a cheerleader in my county." And so it was kind of this open secret that Sheriff Conley had Wayne Dumond's testicles in a jar. So anyway, at trial, the judge said that no information about Wayne's castration or Coolidge Conley displaying his testicles would be allowed in court, and neither could any of the information about his house being set on fire. He said this would only prejudice the jury in Wayne's favor and had nothing to do with the underlying crime that he was being accused of, which is true. So anyway, it was a pretty open and shut case. The victim testified and said, "That was the guy. I saw him. His face was this close to mine. That was his truck. I saw his truck in my driveway." I mean, it was basically an open and shut case. They also had forensic evidence, the biological material that they had tested. Now remember, again, no DNA, but they had several characteristics that they could point out. So number one, there was no sperm in the fluid. So that meant that the person who contributed that seminal fluid had had a vasectomy. The other thing was that he was a type A blood type. Another thing was that the person, the donor, was someone who secreted a particular enzyme in their bodily fluids. This might be a little bit over my head because this is kind of an obsolete biological test that they were doing. But basically, there's only a certain percentage of people who secrete this particular enzyme in their bodily fluids. So this person had had a vasectomy, was type A blood, and was a secretor of this particular enzyme. Now, Wayne Dumond had had a vasectomy through the VA, and they tested him, and indeed, he was type A blood and secreted this particular enzyme. So even though it wasn't 1 in a million, it was 1 in 60,000. And I mean, what are the chances that the victim would have picked just some rando who just so happened to have all of those characteristics? Not very high. So based on all this evidence, the jury found him guilty. He was given a pretty big sentence. He was sentenced to life without parole. And you might say, whoa, hey, that's kind of a lot for kidnapping and rape. But he had this long criminal history. And like I said, Ashley was the daughter of one of the most wealthy, prominent men in town. So it's not entirely outrageous. Let's just put it that way. Now, the important part about this whole thing is that, yes, her father was a pretty wealthy, prominent businessman in Forest City. But the other thing is that he's a distant cousin of Bill Clinton, who was the governor at the time. And yes, he had donated to Clinton's political campaign. Why should that matter? I'm glad you asked. So from the time Wayne was arrested, his wife Dusty, who was like real Christian, okay, real churchy type, she immediately went on a crusade that her husband was innocent and this hussy, Ashley, had just accused the wrong man. She talked to her preacher. She did letter writing campaigns, everything she could do. She even called Ashley on the phone to try and convince her that she'd been mistaken.
Is this bitch for real?
They, of course, asked Bill Clinton to either give him a pardon or clemency to, let him get out of prison. And Bill Clinton wouldn't do it. You could say, oh, he was prejudiced because that was his niece or what have you. But, it wasn't his business. So as time goes on, Dusty is getting more and more people on her side, trying to convince everyone that Wayne is innocent. They're claiming that the DNA test was incorrect because they had gotten this other person, this other scientist out of Atlanta named Moses Shanfield, who had tested the biological material and said, there's no way that biological material came from Wayne Dumond. Well, he had not factored in the fact that biological material had 2 donors present, one of which was, of course, Ashley. The material had been in her mouth and she spit it out. So her saliva and probably, buccal cells or whatever had also been mixed in with that. Moses Shanfield didn't take that into account. So of course his results were completely unusable, right? But they latched onto this. Their alibi for him was that he was sick. He had stayed home from work that day sick. And they knew he was sick because when their daughter came home that afternoon, about 20 minutes after Wayne Dumond had left Ashley's house, which they lived really close, it would have been super easy for him to drive from Ashley's house back to his home within 20 minutes and gotten undressed and changed and done everything before their daughter came home. No problem. But the daughter said, oh, when I came home, he was still hot and feverish. The whole family claimed the day before he'd been at a birthday party and had left early after an hour and a half. That don't seem early to me. So anyway, they're getting more and more people behind them. One of the people is this crazy right-wing preacher up here in Fayetteville named J. Cole, but that's a whole different story. But just remember that J. Cole, being a fundamentalist Baptist minister, was friends with another fundamentalist Baptist minister named Mike Huckabee. So anyway, as she's gathering more support for Wayne's cause, the original allegation that Bill Clinton was just prejudiced against Wayne because Ashley was his distant cousin started to grow. Next, it wasn't just that he was prejudiced against Wayne. It now had become that Bill Clinton himself had made sure to get Wayne arrested and railroaded for this crime that he didn't commit. Some people were even saying that Bill Clinton had arranged to have him castrated. Now, if you think about that for just a goddamn minute, why would the governor of a state go through all the trouble to have a man castrated and railroaded who did not actually rape his cousin? It didn't really take much to convince a lot of these religious types that Bill Clinton was somehow involved in all of this. They already hated him. There had already been this sort of cottage industry of anti-Clinton conspiracy theories ever since he had first been elected in 1979, okay? He was known to have protested against the Vietnam War. He got a deferment as a Rhodes Scholar. And so in their minds, that made him a traitor. He was absolutely just filth because he had spoken out and did not serve in the Vietnam War. So anyway, this had been, kind of bubbling up and simmering in Arkansas for years, right? But then when Bill Clinton decided to run for president, he announced in 1991, that's when bigger forces started taking notice. That's when some of the big right-wing media owners and political operatives started looking for ways to smear Bill Clinton because they saw him as a major threat. He was Southern, he was really popular, he was smart, he was charismatic. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not in love with Bill Clinton, okay? I disagree with him on a lot of shit. But he is not the devil that these fundamentalists have been painting him as. Hillary neither, okay? Anyway, once these national operatives started digging around in Arkansas, it was not hard to find the Wayne Dumond conspiracy theory, and it got amplified. Ward Huckabee of the Village Voice, as well as Steve Dunleavy at the New York Post, and other sort of right-wing media types would bring it up and use it to say, oh, Bill Clinton was basically running Arkansas like a mob boss and having innocent people attacked and castrated and thrown in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. So anyway, I'm skipping over a lot of stuff here because, again, I wrote a whole book about it. But the important part is that through the Whitewater investigation, anyone who'd ever had any dealings with Bill Clinton or any of Bill Clinton's associates, I mean, if you basically existed within 4 degrees of Bill Clinton, Ken Starr and his goons were coming down here to investigate your ass. And the only way to get them off of your ass was to give them something on the Clintons. So anyway, through the Whitewater investigation, the governor at the time, Jim Guy Tucker, was convicted of some counts of mail fraud. Again, a whole thing. I wrote a whole book. Because Jim Guy Tucker now could no longer serve as governor. It's in the Arkansas Constitution that convicted felons cannot serve. So he had to step down. So that meant that the lieutenant governor, whoever that was, would then be elevated to the position of governor. And the lieutenant governor was a guy named Mike Huckabee. And the only reason he won that was because he had the support of the Baptists behind him and other, fundamentalist types. So anyway, there was a whole big kerfluffle, but in the end, Mike Huckabee was named as the governor. So it was really clear that him and J. Cole had still been on good terms because literally just a couple of months after he was sworn in, Huckabee came out and declared that he was going to pardon Wayne Dumond. Now, the way it works in Arkansas is that when the governor says they're thinking of pardoning someone, they have to state it publicly, and then they have from 30 days to 120 days to get input from the public before it can be made official, right? So it's like you announce your intent, and then you have to wait 30 days before saying yes, for sure, but you can't wait more than 120 days. So there's this window of time where you're supposed to be getting input from the public before you make your final decision. Well, numerous people spoke out against this. Ashley herself, along with one of Wayne's earlier victims and her lawyer, came to speak to Mike Huckabee personally to beg him not to pardon Wayne Dumond. And the lawyer said it was obvious that Mike Huckabee did not know the first thing about the case. He had only heard from J. Cole and what he'd read in the New York Post and was convinced that Wayne Dumond was innocent. Nothing the lawyer said, nothing Ashley said could convince him. There were protests by law enforcement officials and women representatives on the State House steps saying, "Don't release Dumond." There was a letter writing campaign. One of Wayne's earlier victims and her daughter, the little girl who'd been in the bed with her, wrote to him. There was a lot of public outcry saying, "Don't release Wayne Dumond." What did Mike Huckabee do, this profile in courage? He illegally called a meeting of the parole board. At that meeting, the head of the parole board, a guy named Leroy Brownlee, declared they needed to go into executive session. Now, executive sessions are closed. No media is allowed, and it's not subject to FOIA requests. So basically, closed door, secret meeting. The only reason the parole board is supposed to go into executive session is to discuss personnel matters, like hiring someone, firing someone, not talking about individual parole cases. Well, several of the parole boards have come out after this and said that at that meeting that Mike Huckabee called, once they went into executive session, they didn't even allow notes. They sent the secretary home. Like, not even a record was going to exist. These board members would later say that he specifically brought up Wayne Dumond and was like, don't you think this is, too much of a sentence for him? Like, that's awfully steep. And only one of these board members, came back at him and was like, well, that's what he got. That was a jury of his peers sentenced him, and, it's not really that out of line. Some of these board members said it was clear that most of them did not want to argue with the governor, because bear in mind, these board members are appointed or reappointed to their jobs by the governor. So this is basically their boss. Nobody's going to say anything against their boss. So anyway, after this secret meeting where he basically argued that Wayne Dumond needed to go free, then Huckabee just kind of laid low, and Leroy Brownlee started taking action. So he started communicating with Huckabee's prison liaison. First thing was, right after that meeting, Wayne Dumond submitted a petition to get a new parole hearing. Now, normally, you have to wait for an entire year from your last parole hearing. His last parole hearing had just been a few months ago, and he had been 100% denied. But he went ahead and submitted this. And the way that it works is that it only takes one member of the parole board to approve it. So one person reads it. If that first person approves it, then no one else on the board really needs to read the petition or sign off on it or anything like that. And that original petition was approved by who else? Leroy Brownlee. That petition, as well as his approval of it, are just gone. Like, they don't exist anymore, if they ever existed at all. Then there was the little problem that Cummins Unit, which is where Wayne Dumond was imprisoned at, had a specific schedule for their parole hearings, and it was going to be like over a year until they could actually just schedule a parole hearing. So Wayne got transferred to a different prison, the Tucker Unit. That seems odd. When asked about it, different prison officials gave different answers. One guy said it was because Wayne had been part of some clique that they were trying to bust up. Another one said, it had been a disciplinary thing. Another one said, it was because he was in danger of his life, and so it was for his safety. Like, it was clear that it was just bullshit. Okay, he got moved so that his parole hearing could get scheduled earlier, because Mike Huckabee was going to have to make his decision by January 19th, okay? And that would be a public decision. If the parole board paroled Wayne before that time, then Mike Huckabee didn't have to have anything to do with it, okay? So he gets his parole hearing, and parole gets granted. However, there was a stipulation. He was not to be allowed to live in Arkansas. He was going to have to find some other state that would be willing to take him in. And it took about 18 months before he was able to get any state to take him. Texas said no, Missouri said no, and Florida said no. But then something happened. So Dusty, who had spent years advocating on his behalf, working super hard to get him out, she ended up getting into a car accident and died. Because Wayne's case had been taken up by all these fundamentalist religious types, there had been this church group from Kansas City, Missouri, that had been going down to visit him. And this particular woman named Terry Sue Wood had been in this church group visiting Wayne, and I guess they fell in love, or at least she did. And within a few months of Wayne getting out of prison, they got married. And now that he had a connection to Missouri, because Terry Sue was from Missouri, he reapplied to Missouri, and this time because he had like a documented connection to Missouri, they approved it. And he moved up to Kansas City, Missouri with his new wife, Terry Sue. They were married in late August. 6 weeks later, on December 21st, 2000, Wayne called his parole officer and said he felt like he had a stomach virus and wasn't going to be able to go into work. He didn't go into work that day, and in fact, when Terry Sue came home from work that evening, she found him passed out on the garage floor with a half bottle of whiskey next to him, and he was all like scratched up and bruised up. He said he'd fallen down some stairs. That same day, a woman named Carol Sue Shields was found dead in her boyfriend's apartment. She had been sexually assaulted. Her clothes were missing. She had been tied up, and it looked like she'd been tied up with zip ties, but the zip ties were not there. And her clothes were missing, but next to her naked body was a torn plastic bag, which she had been asphyxiated with. There weren't any fingerprints or any seminal fluid or anything like that, but they were able to find DNA, skin, underneath her fingernails where she had fought her attacker. They sent it off for DNA testing and waited. So meanwhile, Wayne was out here living free, giving the occasional interview to right-wing media. Then, the following year, on June 21st, Sara Andrasek was found dead in her apartment. She had just graduated with a BA in sociology, had been married, and they had literally just found out days earlier that she was pregnant with their first child. Sara Andrasek's crime scene was remarkably similar to Carol Sue Shields's. She had also been stripped naked, sexually assaulted. It was clear she had been tied up. This time it looked like with a rope. Not only were her clothes missing, but the sheet off of the bed was also missing. And as CSIs looked through the apartment, they found a tiny little piece of rope that had gotten stuck in the drain of the bathtub, where clearly her attacker had been trying to clean things up. The very next day, the DNA match from the Arkansas Crime Lab finally came back. The DNA underneath Carol Sue Shields' fingernails was a match to Wayne Dumond. Because he was on parole, they knew where he lived, they were able to quickly pick him up and arrest him and give him basically the charge of violating parole while they built their case. When they searched his workplace, they found some rather incriminating evidence. They found zip ties that matched the kind of ties that had been used on Carol Sue Shields, as well as pieces of her bra that could be matched to what he had left behind. They also found a rope that was remarkably similar to the rope that had been found at Sara Andrasek's home. They found a latex glove that had Sara Andrasek's DNA on it as well. So the two crimes had actually happened in separate counties. Carol Sue Shields had been killed in Clay County, whereas Sara Andrasek had been killed in Platte County. So the Clay County case went to trial first. And, even though Wayne tried to claim he was homesick all day, even though no one else could corroborate that alibi, his DNA was under her fingernails. He had scratches and bruises all over him when he came home that day. I mean, it was just obvious. He was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Meanwhile, the prosecutor in Platte County was putting together the case against him for Sara Andrasek's murder. But because Wayne was in prison for life anyway, there clearly wasn't a whole lot of rush. And I don't really fault the prosecutor for this. Their priority is going to be the criminals who are still out there and who pose a danger to the public. Wayne was already behind bars and he wasn't getting out. So I understand that Sarah's case kind of went to the bottom of the pile. Unfortunately, though, only a year later, Wayne Dumond, who had lied his ass off, had contracted cancer of the vocal cords, and he died in prison. So even though it was clear that he was probably Sara Andrasek's murderer, because he died before charges could be brought or he could face trial, she's often not considered as, one of his victims. But she is. So anyway, that would have been the end of the case, except that in 2008, Mike Huckabee decided he wanted to run for president. And that's when the cases of Carol Sue Shields and Sara Andrasek were brought back into the public spotlight. Basically, it was kind of a Willie Horton type deal where his political opponents were saying, rightfully, that if Mike Huckabee hadn't have released Wayne Dumond, then Carol Sue Shields and Sara Andrasek would still be alive. Now, Huckabee, the paragon of character and virtue, every time he was asked about it, would claim he didn't do it. The parole board paroled him. He had nothing to do with that. But through investigation, they found how he had basically pressured the parole board. When confronted with that, he would just lie. He would just lie, okay, and say he had nothing to do with that. And then he would, of course, turn it around on the person questioning him and accuse them of politicizing such a terrible tragedy. How could you? What an asshole. So anyway, that's the case of Wayne Dumond. I know I've kind of been all over the place with it. I didn't have a script. I just tried to kind of wing it. Thank you so much for waiting around for one of my videos. I know it's been a while, and I promise I'll start uploading some more soon. I finally finished writing my manuscript, and now I'm about to get started on the editing process with my publisher. So I can't promise that it's going to be really regular, but I do promise that I'm going to come out with more videos soon. I want to thank you again for spending time with me and for subscribing and liking and leaving comments. Thanks. Until next time, Darklings. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more. You can help me make more true crime content by supporting me on Patreon, where for as little as a cup of coffee, you can get early access to videos, bonus content, and free Murder Nerd merch. The link is in the description.